Ravenna, the western capital of the Roman Empire, a cathedral in late summer. The 22nd of August 408, Stilicho is inside. He has held command of the Western Army for 13 years, regent for the Emperor Honorius since 395. He has just walked into sanctuary to escape an arrest order. The order came from his own emperor. Olympius, an official at the court, has convinced Honorius of a plot. He claims Stilicho plans to put his own son Eucherius on the eastern throne. The accusation is unsupported. The emperor believes it. Soldiers surround the church. They promise his life if he comes out. He comes out. The order changes, not arrest, execution. His Gothic bodyguards, standing a few yards away, offer to fight for him. He refuses, he kneels, he presents his neck. He is decapitated. The man the Romans have just executed is the only Western official who can manage Alaric. 2 years later, on the 24th of August 410, the Salarian Gate will open from inside. Inside this church is the moment that gate opened. Pull back from the cathedral. Pull back to the empire that ordered the execution, the Western Roman Empire, the Pars Occidentis, constituted as a separate political entity on the 17th of January 395, with the death of Theodosius I. The empire was partitioned between his sons. Arcadius held the east from Constantinople. Honorius, 10 years old at his accession, held the west. Stilicho, his regent, held it for him. The active forensic window for this episode is 376 to 410, 34 years, from the Gothic crossing of the Danube under Valens to the Salarian Gate opening under Honorius. The geography is the Western Mediterranean and its frontiers, Italy, Gaul, Hispania, Britain, North Africa, the Rhine and Danube limits, and the Balkan diocese where Alaric operated. The central question of this episode is narrow. By 410, the Romans had a working census, they had a working tax code, they had military roles, and the chronicles of Adrianople fought 32 years before. The question is not what was hidden, the question is why what was visible was not connected. The principal sources are these: Ammianus Marcellanus, the last great Latin historian of pagan Rome on the late 4th century. Zosimus, hostile and writing a century later, but the principal narrative for the events of 408 to 410. Olympiodorus of Thebes, surviving in fragments. Orosius and Augustine for the Christian response. Jerome's letters from his monastery in Bethlehem, the Notitia Dignitatum and the Codex Theodosianus. The scholarly frame is contested. Peter Heather and Brian Ward-Perkins, both writing in 2005, read the late Western Empire as undone by external pressure that produced material collapse. Guy Halsall, in 2007, restates the barbarian migrations as a problem internal to Roman politics. Walter Goffart, in 1980, argued that the post-410 settlements operated through legal and fiscal mechanisms rather than violent conquest. This episode adopts the structural breaking point reading. The empire in 395 looked like a state at full extension. The strengths were real, so were the structural costs each one carried. The Western Army was organized along reformed lines. Mobile field forces, the comitatenses, paired with frontier garrisons, the limitanae, both under the command of the Magister Militum. The Notitia Dignitum lays the structure out in detail. Several thousand offices and units, civil and military, with shield insignia and deployment locations. The hidden cost was the composition of the field strength. A substantial fraction was federate. Gothic Frankish, Alan units serving under their own leaders paid by treaty. The 30,000 men Alaric commanded against Rome included foederati, who had deserted Honorius after the August 408 massacre of their families. The army that defended Rome in 408 was structurally indistinguishable from the army that sacked it in 410. The senatorial aristocracy was richer in absolute terms than any prior generation. The Sammaci, the Anici, the great households of the city of Rome. Olympiodorus reports incomes in the thousands of pounds of gold. The hidden cost was that this wealth had detached from the cities that produced it. The class that traditionally funded municipal life had moved to rural villas. They no longer paid for paving, water supply, public games, or council service. They resisted the curial obligations that had sustained the urban tax base for centuries. The wealth was vertical. The civic structure beneath it had hollowed out. Rome and the western cities still received the annona, the state-organized grain shipment from North Africa, in place since the early empire. The urban populations were fed. They were politically quiet. The hidden cost was that Africa was a single point of failure. When Alaric marched on Ostia in 409, he understood this. Ostia was the lever, not Rome itself. Within 30 years, the Vandals would take Carthage. The Annona would fail. Rome's population would contract from approaching 1 million to perhaps a tenth of that figure. Theodosius's settlement of 382 gave the Goths land in the Balkans under their own leaders, in return for military service. The arrangement was within precedent. Rome had been settling barbarian groups inside the Limes since the 2nd century. The hidden cost in Heather's reading was that the 382 settlement broke precedent in one specific respect. It left the Goths intact as a political unit under their own kings. Alaric's career is unintelligible without that fact. By 408, he was simultaneously a Roman officer claiming the title of Magister Militum and a Gothic king. The Notitia Dignitatum is the most striking artifact of late Roman state capacity. Several thousand offices, civil and military, with shield insignia, deployment locations, and chains of command. The hidden cost was that parts of it were already a fiction by the time the ink dried. Roger Collins notes that the Western Notitia was an archasing text. Its unreliability is visible in the units listed in Britain and Spain. Other evidence shows those units had departed or had never been deployed there at all. The state could draw the map of itself with confidence. The map had not been audited against the ground. The records of erosion sit in the legislation, the chronicles, and the army rolls of the long 4th century. The flight of the Curiales is visible from 326 onward. Constantine's law of that year forbade decurions from leaving their cities. The Codex Theodosianus, Book 12, contains over 190 constitutions targeting decurion evasion. The earliest dates to 312, the latest to 436. The 365 rescript of Valentinian and Valens punished decurions who concealed deserters. The 386 law under Theodosius authorized governors to seize the estates of Curiales who absconded. The seized burden was redistributed to the Curiales who remained. By 410, curial status was hereditary, leaving it was criminalized. Evading it was routine by every legal device the senatorial class could deploy. The class that funded municipal life and collected imperial taxes was withdrawing across the entire 4th century. The state's response was coercive, not corrective. This is the elite withdrawal half of the diagnosis in the legislation itself. The Gothic crossing of the Danube in summer 376 is recorded by Ammianus Marcellinus in Book 31. The Tervingi under Fritigern and Alavivus, with the Grothangi following, requested asylum from Hunnic pressure. Valens admitted the Tervingi as foederati. The Grothangi crossed anyway. Within months, the local Roman command, the Comites Lupicinus and Maximus, had produced a famine. Ammianus accuses them of profiteering on grain and selling Goths into slavery for dog meat. The provincial command produced the revolt by mismanaging the relief. The refugees the empire admitted in spring became the army that destroyed it at Adrianople 2 years later. The empire's frontier management apparatus could not handle a refugee crisis without producing the very enemy it had admitted. The 376 crossing is the proximate cause of every subsequent Gothic problem the Western state faced, including the cause of the man kneeling outside the cathedral at Ravenna in August 408. Adrianople, fought on the 9th of August 378, was the most significant Roman defeat in 3 centuries. Valens engaged the Goths with around 15,000 men, 2/3 of the Eastern Field Army. Roman intelligence underestimated Gothic numbers at 10,000. Actual Gothic strength was 12 to 15,000, plus returning cavalry. The Roman army arrived at the battlefield exhausted after an 8-mile march in heat. The battle opened before formation was complete. Returning Gothic cavalry struck the Roman flank. Around 20,000 Romans were killed. Valens died in the fighting. His body was never recovered. Ammianus closed his history with the verdict that never since Cannae had there been such slaughter. Theodosius's response in 382 was settlement, not victory. By 410, Adrianople was 32 years in the past, and Ammianus's text was in circulation. The lesson available to Honorius's court was that a treaty does not dissolve the federate problem. The frontier withdrawals between 401 and 407 are recorded across multiple sources. Stilicho recalled the 6th Victrix from Britain in 401 and 402 to defend Italy against Alaric. Claudian's De Bello Gallico names the legion. Stilicho stripped the Rhine garrison further in 405 and 406 to fight Radagaisus's invasion of Italy. On the 31st of December, 406, by the traditional dating, the Vandals, Alans and Sueves crossed the frozen Rhine into Gaul. The British army then mutinied and elevated Constantine III. He crossed the Channel into Gaul in 407, taking what remained of the British garrison with him. By 407, the Western Empire was operating without effective field forces on either of its long northern frontiers. The cost of holding Italy had been the abandonment of the perimeter. The signal was unmistakable in the legislative and military record. The court at Ravenna in 408 governed as if this had not happened. The cleanest signal of the central question is internal to the Notitia Dignitatum itself. The western section of the document was finalized circa 425. It still names dozens of units as active in regions where other evidence shows them gone, or never present at all. It lists units stationed in Britain after the de facto Roman departure of 410. It lists units stationed in Spain after the Vandal, Sueve and Alan settlements there. It lists units lost in earlier campaigns as if at full strength. The discrepancy is not minor. Michael Kulikowski's 2000 article in Historia and David Hoffman's earlier prosopographical reconstruction reach the same conclusion. The Notitia's strata reflect successive partial updates that never resolved into an audit. The Romans were keeping records. They were not reading the records against the ground. The first document is Rutilius Nematianus's De Reditu Suo, written around 416 to 417. In Book 2, lines 41 to 60, Rutilius accuses Stilicho of destroying the Sibylline books. The books were Rome's official oracular collection. The Quindecem Viri Sastax Faciundis consulted them at moments of state crisis. They had served this function for 900 years. Zosimus, writing decades later, confirms the charge from a hostile pagan position. The act is attested by both pagan accounts. The framework these documents preserve is institutional. The books had been the mechanism by which the Roman state read prodigies as state-relevant signs. A comet was something the Quindecem Viri could interpret as policy guidance. The framework failed in a specific way. A state that destroys its own oracular archive registers, without admitting it, that the archive's authority no longer holds. 2 years later, when the Goths arrived, no functioning institutional mechanism existed for reading what the city was facing. The second document is Jerome's letter 127, written from his monastery in Bethlehem in 411 or 412. It is addressed to Principia. The occasion was Marcella's death. She had been beaten in the sack. The famous line is in section 12, Capita urbs quae totum cepit orbum. The city that took the world has been taken. Jerome's letter 128 to Pacatula reads the sack as the imminent end of history. Letter 60 places it in the same apocalyptic register. The framework is theological. The sack is the climax of the seculum, a sign of the world's age. The framework failed in a specific way. Jerome's letters do not anywhere ask why Rome could not recruit. They do not ask why the African grain supply was exposed. They do not ask why a single executed general's death produced a 30,000-man defection. The apocalyptic frame is large enough to contain the sack as a sign. It is too large to diagnose the structure that produced it. The third document is Augustine's De Civitate Dei. He began writing in 413, 3 years after the sack. The work was completed in 426. The provoking question was pagan. Christianity, the pagans said, had caused the sack by displacing the old gods of Rome. Books 1 through 3 of De Civitate Dei dismantle that claim point by point. The remaining 19 books construct an alternative theology of history. 2 cities, the earthly and the heavenly. A pilgrim soul whose home is not Rome. The framework is salvation history. The sack becomes evidence in a theological argument about which city deserves the Christian's allegiance. The framework failed in a specific way. Augustine is answering what the sack means for the soul. The Notitia and the Curial laws are outside that question's frame. The most important Latin work produced after 410 takes the sack as material for a theology, not as a forensic case file. 2 interpretive frames were available to Romans living through the sack. Pagan oracular and Christian theological, neither could see the system. The system, examined from outside the contemporary frame, is a coupled mechanism in 5 components. The first component is the long fiscal-military squeeze. From the 3rd century forward, the Roman state's tax extraction model relied on a contracting curial class. The class extracted revenue from a contracting agricultural base. The army's costs rose. The denarius failed as a transactional currency by the late 3rd century. The Codex Theodosianus records imperial laws against self-mutilation by men evading military levies. The 381 law of Gratian and Theodosius ordered such men burned alive. Honorius later commuted the punishment to enrollment in nominal service. The state's response to all of this was coercive, not corrective. Hereditary curial status, escalating desertion penalties, and expanded levies on landlords. By 379, the Western state had been managing this slow squeeze for more than a century. None of it was hidden. It was in the legislation. The second component is the Hunnic shock and the 376 admission. The Huns arrived on the western steppe in the 370s. The Turvingi and the Greuthungi pressed against the Danube. Valens admitted the Turvingi as foederati. The local command mismanaged the resettlement to the point of starvation. Adrianople in 378 destroyed the Eastern Field Army. Theodosius's settlement of 382 preserved the Goths as a coherent political unit inside the empire, under their own kings. Heather reads this with the emphasis on external pressure exceeding Roman absorptive capacity. Halsall reads it with the emphasis on a Roman political choice that constituted the Goths as a distinct actor. The result of either reading is the same. A sub-state actor existed inside Roman territory, whose operating logic the empire could not dictate. The third component is the hardening of the federate dependency between 395 and 408. Stilicho governed the West for 13 years through containment and partnership with Alaric. There were periods of formal alliance, including for joint campaigns against the East. Alaric held the eastern title of Magister Militum per Illyricum at one point. He demanded the western title at others. The line between Roman officer and Gothic king became administratively meaningless. Stilicho stripped troops from Britain, the Rhine, and parts of Gaul to defend Italy against Alaric and Radagaisus. The cost was the Rhine crossing of 406. The cost was Constantine III's usurpation of 407. By 408, the Western army was, in effective field strength, primarily federate. The man who held this system together was the man Honorius would order executed on the 22nd of August. The fourth component is the political failure of August 408. Olympius convinced Honorius that Stilicho was plotting to put Eucherius on the eastern throne. Stilicho was executed on the 22nd of August. Roman soldiers in northern Italian cities then massacred the wives and children of federate troops. Around 30,000 federates deserted to Alaric. The figure is a modern reconstruction, drawing on Zosimus and Olympiodorus. In 3 weeks, the Western army had killed its own commander, transferred a significant fraction of its strength to its principal enemy, and produced no replacement leadership. Olympius's anti-Germanic faction at court had executed a structural function. The senator Lampadius had named that function earlier, opposing the 408 ransom vote. Non est ista pax sed pactio servitutis. This is not peace but a pact of servitude. The fifth component is the negotiation failure between 408 and 410. Alaric's demands across 2 years were within precedent. Seasonal tribute. Lands in Noricum and Pannonia, the title of Magister Militum. Each request was smaller in scope than what Theodosius had granted the Goths in 382. Honorius refused each iteration. The court paid ransoms in between. The Roman court at Ravenna was operating on the assumption that Alaric must eventually go away. Alaric was operating on the assumption that he must eventually be paid. 3 sieges of Rome record the failure. The first in late 408, the second in 409, with the puppet emperor Priscus Attalus elevated and then deposed. The third in August 410. On the night of the 24th of August 410, the Salarian Gate opened from inside. These 5 components are all present in the empire's own records: the Codex Theodosianus, the army rolls, Ammianus's history, the curial registers, the inventory of the 408 ransom. The mechanism is recorded. What is not recorded anywhere in the contemporary documentation is the coupling between them. Stilicho's body lay outside the cathedral at Ravenna on the morning of the 22nd of August. From that morning forward, the chronology to 410 was overdetermined. The Federate massacre in northern Italy followed within days. The defection of around 30,000 fighters to Alaric followed within weeks. 6 weeks after Stilicho's death, Alaric was in Italy. The Roman court at Ravenna issued no replacement strategy. The court was, by deliberate location, removed from the Senate at Rome and from the army's deployment in the field. In late 408, Alaric invested Rome. The city starved. The Senate accused Serena of secret correspondence with the besiegers. Serena was Stilicho's widow. She was the niece of Theodosius and the adoptive mother of Honorius. Galla Placidia, Theodosius' daughter, voted for the death sentence. Serena was strangled. The execution did not lift the siege. Rome ransomed itself, per Zosimus's account in 541. 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, 3,000 scarlet-dyed skins, 3,000 pounds of pepper. The siege ended on those terms in early 409. In 409, Alaric returned. Negotiations with Honorius collapsed. Alaric elevated a senatorial figure, Priscus Attalus, as puppet emperor. Attalus held the throne for several months. Honorius received 4,000 troops from the east. He refused Alaric's terms again. Alaric deposed. The puppet emperor experiment ended. The terms Alaric proposed in 409 were already smaller than what he had asked at the start of 408. Each refusal narrowed his options. The third siege began. The Salarian Gate opened at midnight on the 24th of August, 410. The chroniclers say it was opened by treachery from inside, without specifying the agent. The Goths took the city. The sack was selective. Churches and the right of asylum were largely respected, per Erosion in Book 7, Chapter 39. Galla Placidia, the daughter of Theodosius, was taken hostage. 22 months earlier, she had voted for Serena's execution. The Senate she voted with had believed killing a Theodosian princess would lift the siege. The Goths who took Galla Placidia hostage in August 410 demonstrated, as a single forensic point, that it had not. Marcella was beaten in her home, per Jerome's letter 127, section 13. The sack lasted 3 days. Procopius would later record the apocryphal anecdote of Honorius and his pet chickens. The story is 6th century gossip. The kernel of disconnection between emperor and event is in the chronology itself. In late 410, Alaric marched south, intending to cross to Africa. A storm destroyed his fleet at Rhegium. Alaric died of disease soon after. Jordanes records the burial in the Getica. The Goths placed him in the riverbed of the Bucento. The river was diverted for the burial and then restored. In 414, his successor Athaulef married Galla Placidia at Narbonne. In 439, the Vandals took Carthage. The Annona failed. On the 4th of September, 476, Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus. That is the conventional end date for the Western Empire. The political form had ceased to govern most of the West, well before 476. The diagnosis is this. The Western Roman state collapsed into the Salarian Gate in 410, not because contemporaries lacked information, because they lacked a frame for reading it. The fiscal-military squeeze was visible in the Codex Theodosianus across a century. The federate dependency was visible in the army rolls. Adrianople was visible in Ammianus. The withdrawal of the curial class was visible in the legislation that tried to chain it back. The Notitia Dignitatum recorded units that no longer existed. Stilicho's execution was a self-inflicted wound the Roman court did not register as such. The diagnosis is fiscal-military overstretch coupled with elite withdrawal from civic obligation, in a state that no longer audited itself. The pattern recurs. After 755, the Tang dynasty had outsourced frontier defense to military commanders called the Jiadushi. They were structurally indispensable and politically uncontainable, and Lushan's revolt of 755 destroyed the central tax base. The dynasty survived another century and a half. It never recovered fiscal capacity. Military overstretch resolved by federate-style devolution produces a state that cannot reabsorb its own function. It recurs earlier and at greater scale. In late Han China, after 180 of the Common Era, tax revenue went to aristocratic estates the central court could not assess. Provincial commanders accumulated military power the center could not contain. The Yellow Turban revolts of 184 exposed the coupling. The court read each rebellion as local. The same pattern 2 centuries earlier than 410 at Asian scale. On the 22nd of August, 408, Stilicho stepped out of the cathedral at Ravenna. He believed the empire he served still functioned. The men who killed him believed the same. Neither was right.